Primo Levis Shema. Shema, the Hebrew word for hear, H-E-A-R, is the first word in the first verse of the Shema, the iconic Jewish prayer at the heart of both the morning and evening service, recited every day by observant Jews. The verse occurs in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of Moses. Hear, O Israel, Hashem our God, Hashem is one. Deuteronomy 6:4. I shall revisit these words later, paying special attention to the idea that the divine is singular. But my talk is about another Shema, the Shema of Primo Levi, the Italian Jewish chemist and writer who was born in Turin in 1919 and died there in 1987. Like Orpheus, Levi visited the underworld during his lifetime, spending 11 months in a hell called Auschwitz. His poem, Shema, refers to this hell and puts a question to the reader. It is not an easy poem to hear, nor a simple question to answer. First I will read the poem, then I will discuss it. Shema by Primo Levi. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman, without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts at home, in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. The poem, which of course was written in Italian, stands as a kind of preface to Levi's memoir of Auschwitz. That is the source of the title of the memoir, If This Is a Man. In this talk, I shall reverse the sequence. I shall dip into the memoir as a kind of preface before discussing the poem. Levi's memoir concludes with a short section, the story of 10 days. On the 10th day, 27th of January 1945, the Russian army arrived at the gates of Auschwitz and liberated the camp. That event on that day is what determines the annual date of Holocaust Memorial Day, which is tomorrow. Immediately after entering the date 27 January, Levi writes a sentence consisting of just one word, dawn. Dawn, a fitting word coming as it does at the end of a nightmare, which for Levi began in earnest in February 1944, when he was transported to Auschwitz from the internment camp at Fossili in northern Italy. Dawn. The word, standing alone, suggests more than the departure of night. It is like a proclamation, coming, unlike the dawn command normally barked at Levi and his fellow prisoners every day in the camp, from outside the camp, outside Hades, coming from the world. Reading dawn at the end of the tunnel, you feel pinpricks of new life under your skin. You hear an echo of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 3. Let there be light, the phrase that creates the first day. Except that with the very next sentence, Levi plunges us back into the abyss. On the floor, he writes, the shameful wreck of skin and bones, the somagy thing. The somagy thing, now a corpse, was once a human being, a man. Not any man or every man, but a particular man. A Hungarian chemist about 50 years old, thin, tall, and taciturn. That's how Levi describes him. 27th of January 1945 did not dawn for him. Yet even for somagy, that day was a liberation of sorts, with the return of the humanity of which he had been stripped in the camp. Levi writes, the Russians arrived while Charles a companion and fellow prisoner, and I were carrying Somaji a little distance outside. He was very light. We overturned the stretcher on the grey snow. Then, and I'm quoting again, Charles took off his beret. Levi adds at once, I regretted not having a beret. He regretted it not because he would like to have covered his shaven head in the icy Polish winter, but, on the contrary, because he would like to have been able to uncover it, to have made the same gesture that Charles made. He could not remove a beret that he wasn't wearing, so he could not pay his respects to their dead comrade. Between them, between Charles's gesture and Levi's regret, Somaji was honoured as a human being. Posthumously, his dignity was restored. How exactly? What had Charles and Levi done to elevate Somaji, to resuscitate his humanity? It's quite simple. They brought him to mind. Amid the delirium of their own liberation, they did not forget him. They remembered him. They remembered him, the nearest thing to bringing him back to life. This, in a manner of speaking, was the very first Holocaust Memorial service, conducted by two survivors at midday on the 27th of January 1945 on the grey snow of Auschwitz. Even as the camp was being liberated, the entire ceremony condensed into the doffing of a beret. Which brings me to this occasion on the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day 2021. How do you remember 1 million deaths, let alone 6, or 10, or 20? For all atrocities, all crimes against humanity are referenced by this day. Is there room in the human mind to accommodate such a quantity of souls? How do you not lose count of the dead? If we were counting sheep, we would fall asleep. But the whole point of Holocaust Memorial Day is to wake up, as if day were dawning. As Levi writes, what happened could happen again. He adds, conscience can be seduced and obscured again, even our consciences. For this reason, he continues, I'm quoting, it is everyone's duty to reflect on what happened. But how do you so much as conceive of what happened, let alone reflect on it? How do you comprehend the scale of the Holocaust, or the Middle Passage? How can we do justice to these crimes? We cannot. The carnage deadens our senses. Consequently, Holocaust Memorial Day runs the risk of deteriorating into mere piety, a matter of stiffly going through the motions, solemnly looking down at our shoes, hands folded in front of us, our gesture of respect, in contrast with Charles removing his beret, empty. But what sort of people are we if we do not make the effort? So much by way of preface. Keeping all this in mind, I turn now to the text of Levi's poem Shema. Theodor Adorno, the German Jewish philosopher, famously once said, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Later, he appears to have backtracked, but there is something right about his remark. How can the fragility of poetry survive the shockwaves of Auschwitz? And yet, barely 1 year after Auschwitz, Levi wrote Shema. Moreover, in an afterword to his memoirs, he says, if I had not lived the Auschwitz experience, I probably would never have written anything. He adds, it was the experience of the camp and the long journey home that forced me to write. You could almost say that for Levi, not writing poetry after Auschwitz would have been barbaric, or at least a dereliction of something like duty, but a Kantian sense of duty, a duty dictated from within. He says he was forced to write, but only in the sense that he freely followed his own inclination. It was an inner imperative that he obeyed. He wrote because of an irresistible urge. He had something urgent to say. That's the point. Not just to get it off his chest, but to confront his fellow man and woman with what he needs us to hear. Shema, hear. Let's see if we can. It's no accident that Levi takes the word Shema for the title of his poem. The poem is an echo of the prayer, and we shall not hear what Levi says if we fail to catch the overtones. Nor is it just a matter of overtones. Levi, as we shall see, places his poem in the space, the sacred ground of the prayer, which is not a prayer, not in the straightforward sense of a plea addressed to heaven. The Shema is addressed to the people. It's what Moses says to Kalal Yisrael, the congregation of Israel, when he reminds them of the day that he came down from the mountain, bringing the Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words or utterances or so-called commandments that he needed them to hear and needs them now to hear again, to hear as if for the first time. He addresses them, the people, as though they themselves, not their parents and grandparents, had come out of Egypt, in other words, slavery, 40 years earlier. He situates them in their imagination at Sinai. When Moses says, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, this is not a plea or a polite request. It is an exhortation, almost a demand. Pay attention, is what Moses is saying. I have something fundamental to say to you. It's crucial that you hear it. Levi superimposes his own Shema on that of Moses, as if to occupy the territory of the prayer. It is, when you think about it, an extraordinary act of artistic audacity. It gives the phrase poetic license a new meaning. Like the Shema of Moses, Levi's Shema is an address, as the very first word indicates. You. You in the plural, voi in Italian. Admittedly, it is a rather different audience from the one Moses addresses, and Levi is coming from the opposite direction, up from Auschwitz, from hell, not down from the mountain. But like Moses, he is burdened with a message, something vital that he needs to impart, not to this person or that, but to everyone. For Moses, everyone means Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Levi's you is differently defined in the first stanza. Let me repeat it. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces. That's the quote. The question is, whom does Levi address? Whom does he mean by you plural? I think he means us, you and me, here and now. It is true that the congregation of Israel was a bit bigger than the one in the virtual Oxford room where I'm giving this talk. Moreover, the wilderness in which the Israelites wandered wasn't Port Meadow in January. So they had the luxury of an alfresco setting. We don't. But Levi puts us in the same position as Moses puts them. He puts us on the spot. He does not deliver the identical message, far from it. The text is as different as the context. Yet when I hear Levi address us against the background of Moses addressing the people, the resonances are so strong that it's as if his words were vibrating across time and space. Remember, to begin with, that the people are fresh out of Egypt, out of bondage, where they toiled under taskmasters, deprived of everything that makes life decent. So is Levi. Auschwitz was his Egypt. And after his deliverance from the camp, he wandered like the people wandered following their liberation. He wandered in the wilderness of Central and Eastern Europe before finally reaching Turin, his home, his promised land. Now, there is not a one-to-one correspondence here, of course, but I am talking about resonances, sounds in the air, impressions that flit between the poem and the prayer, knitting them together in our imagination. In the background of both texts, both Shemas, is desolation, which they tackle in rather different ways. Moses' subject is divinity. Levi's is humanity. Yet there is a common theme between them, singularity. That Hashem, or God, is singular is the first thing that Moses wants the people to hear. Hashem is one, Deuteronomy 6:4. Moses declares, loudly and explicitly. Levi, in contrast, works through a demonstrative pronoun, this. After claiming our attention in the first stanza, in the second, he focuses it. Consider if this is a man. Consider if this is a woman. Now, I shall get back to woman and man in a moment, but for now, what I want to emphasize is the this. Not these or those, but this, singular. If for Moses the divine is singular, so for Levi is the human, even when a person's humanity is in question, as with the woman and the man whom he asks us to consider. Each human being is one, or in the case of the dead, was one. To say again, when Levi and Charles buried Somogyi, they did not bury any man, but a particular man. Earlier I asked, how do you remember 1,000,000 deaths? How do you not lose count? As soon as you number the dead, you lose count. Let us turn to what Levi wants us to consider. If this is a man, if this is a woman. Consider first the if. If implies that there is a question as to whether the conditions that must be met for something to count as human are in fact met in these two cases. This question should give us pause. Suppose this subject were not humanity, but geometry, and the two cases were not a woman and a man, but a triangle and a square. Can we imagine any circumstances in which he would say to us, consider if this is a triangle, if this is a square? Well, possibly, if you have an imagination that is superior to mine. But fundamentally, a square is a square and a triangle is a triangle, and that is that. No ifs or buts, no ifs, because the definitions are not in question. In the case he presents to us in Shema, it is precisely the definition of human that is in question. What counts as human? That is the question we have to consider. That is what is at stake when he fills out the description in each case of the this he presents us with. This, and now I'm quoting from the verse, who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. End of quote. A man or not, does this count as human? This, quoting from the poem again, without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold, like a frog in winter. End of quote. A woman or not, does this count as human? What counts as human? That is the question Levi puts to us when he addresses us. This is what he needs us to consider. Why? Because we take it for granted that we are human. To put it another way, we take our humanity for granted. But what is granted to us was granted to them, to this and to this, except that in their case, it was taken away. That is the message which, coming up from Auschwitz, he urgently needs to impart to us. It is somewhat different from the message that Moses brings down from the mountain, but no less vital to hear. You think you are human, like a square is a square, but you could, in certain circumstances, be stripped of the qualities that define you as human, and still, in your state of privation, persist in space and time. Such is the condition of this and this in Levi's poem, Shema. But is it exactly? Levi asks us to consider. Is this a woman? Is this a man? It is tempting to take the question as rhetorical, suggesting an answer in the negative, but then it would no longer be a question, and it is. When he says consider, he means consider. is this a man? Is this a woman? Actually, it is essential to see that he would never take no for an answer, nor yes. He has seen too much in the camp for either yes or no. No would mean giving up on them as fellow human beings. This he would never do, for he would never succumb to what he calls the law of the lager, the camp. He writes in his memoir, precisely because the lager was a great machine to reduce us to beasts, we must not become beasts. End of quote. But yes would be anodyne. Yes would miss the point, the reason, terrible and profound, for putting the question, consider if. Neither no nor yes will cut it. Then what will? What is the right answer to Levis' question? At one point in his memoir, Levi reflects on the question of what to call figures like the woman and man in his poem, non-men who march and labour in silence, I'm quoting now, the divine spark dead within them, already too empty to really suffer. He writes, one hesitates to call them living, one hesitates to call their death, death. Is this hesitation ambivalence? In a sense, but not ambivalence about where he stands, only about where language stands. Quote, our language lacks words to express this offence, the demolition of a man. So Levi has recourse to different language at different times to describe the same phenomenon, the reduction of a human being to this, to a state of total privation of the qualities that make her or him human. He writes, imagine now a man who is deprived of everyone he loves, and at the same time of his house, his habits, his clothes, in short of everything he possesses. He will be a hollow man or hollow woman. Privation by deprivation. That is the process Levi describes, the hollowing out of a human being in Auschwitz. This process was step one. Step two was murder. The camp sought, says Levi, and I quote him, to annihilate us first as men in order to kill us more slowly afterwards. This is what he means by what he calls the double sense of the term extermination camp. Extinguishing life, biologically speaking, is one sense. Extinguishing the divine spark, hollowing out, is the other. If these imply two different criteria, then a person can be human by one and non-human or no longer human by the other. On this basis, we might seem to have the answer to Levis' question, consider if. But this answer is much too neat, a typical academic philosopher's solution to a question that defies solution, that positively spurns solution, a question we precisely need to keep asking. Which in effect is what Levi says in the next stanza of Shema. I quote, to remind you, I read this out before. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them into your hearts, at home, in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children. End of quote. Here's Moses again. Moses, who says in the first paragraph of his Shema, I quote from Deuteronomy, and these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart. You shall impress them on your children, and you shall speak of them when you sit at home, and when you go on a journey, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Even the final stanza of Levis Shema, the three ominous lines that sound like a curse on those who failed to hear him, even these lines echo Moses, who in his Shema foretells what disasters will befall the people should Israel not hear him. That's Deuteronomy 11, 16 to 17. I said a few minutes ago that if Levi was ambivalent, it was not about where he stands. His parting shot in the memoir, the sentence with which his afterward concludes, begins thus. And finally, I was also helped by the determination which I stubbornly preserved to recognize always, even in the darkest days, in my companions and in myself, men not things. This, in effect, is Levi's answer to the question that Shema poses. Consider if this is human, yes or no. That yes or no is in its way as decisive as the yes or no by which, as he says in one line in the poem, the prisoners at Auschwitz would live or die. The line alludes to the procedure known as the selection, which Levi describes in the first chapter. The life or death of a prisoner was decided by the SS, to the left or to the right, yes or no. Even at this late hour, even 76 years after the fact, the fate of this and this, the two figures in his poem, is in our hands. Levi puts it there. On Holocaust Memorial Day, memorializing the victims of atrocities is not enough. We are called upon to restore to them their humanity. Levis Shema, if I hear him correctly, throws down the gauntlet. Consider if this and this are human, you decide. But the decision cannot be made by the head alone. That's what his parting shot means. You have to take a stand, and he did. He speaks of the determination, his word, which he stubbornly preserved even in the darkest days, his words again. He was determined to recognize this and this as fellow human beings. That made him not merely a man, but a mensch. In the final analysis, the question Primo Levis Shema puts to us points to us. It is a test of our own humanity. Who or what are you? It asks. You singular.